It is my great honor to introduce you to our keynote speaker. We are very fortunate today to have someone with us this morning who will enlighten and educate us about one of the most vexing, difficult, and challenging issues that we face as a country, issues about race and racism. Our speaker is well equipped to do this as the founder and president of An Opportunity Agenda, which is a social justice communication lab dedicated to the idea that our nation can and should be a place where everyone enjoys full opportunity, not similarity between their mission and MACDC mission. Our speaker has had a distinguished career before establishing the Opportunity Agenda Group. He has done work with the Ford Foundation, the Justice Department, where he represented the United States government before the US Supreme Court. So we have in front of us this morning a great leader in a field that is very important and that we all should be talking about. There are difficult conversations currently and ahead. And thanks to the work that the Opportunity Agenda is doing, I know we'll be there and we'll be very strong. So please help me welcome this morning Alan Jenkins. Thank you so much.
Thank you and good morning. So I lost my voice this morning. Bad timing, I know. So you're gonna have to bear with me a little and we're gonna use some visual aids. How are y'all feeling this morning? That was so-so. How are you feeling? Good. All right, much better. So as you heard, my organization is a social justice communication lab. We believe that communication is crucial to moving hearts, minds, and policy for lasting change. And so I hope you will check out our website, opportunityagenda.org. A ton of free communications resources on how to promote greater and more equal opportunity. Thank you very much. I'm working on my tea. Greater and more equal opportunity in housing, in economic development, in criminal justice, in immigration, and in other areas. So please do check us out. Okay. In our world, there tend to be 4 different types of communication that matter. The first is branding, which you all know. Who you are, what you stand for, your values. You need that for fundraising and political power and to get things done. But it's only one kind. A second kind, which you probably know, is campaign communications. What's the 50% plus one strategy for getting a ballot initiative passed or getting people to change their behavior? That tends to be short-term communications. There's a third kind, which if you're lucky you won't have to be involved in, which is crisis communications. Chances are, though, you're going to have to be involved in crisis communications. You come under attack, you have to tell your story quickly. Sometimes there are a lot of inaccuracies floating around. Sometimes there may be a legitimate mistake that you've made, but you need to respond in a crisis. And there's a fourth kind, I'm going to keep you in suspense. Which is the long-term moving of hearts and minds. And when we get that right, all the others fall into place. When we know our story, when we know our narrative, we know what values we stand for, what communities we fight for, then when a crisis comes up, when a campaign comes up, when you need to do branding, you're able to tell your story. And so the lessons I'm going to talk to you about are really about how to tell that story in the long term in ways that inform the short term. Okay, and there's a quiz involved. I probably didn't tell you this. So here's the quiz. This is a branding quiz. If I said to you, computer plus creative plus genius, what brand? Okay, see, I can't really see here. Okay, right, nobody said gateway, right? Yeah. So, okay, car plus safe, what do you say? Volvo, who said Subaru? No, no. Yeah, not at all, not at all. A good try, though. They're not a sponsor, are they? Okay. Subaru's awesome. Okay. Here's another example that I actually found in my mother-in-law's supermarket. Do you all know this brand? Who's the marketing genius that decided to call their pancakes crusty-ass pancakes? So, my mother-in-law said to me, no, it's crusties. Does it really matter? This is a bad name for pancakes. So, why am I sharing this with you? You may be wondering. Because a lot of us, when we talk about racial and ethnic equity and inclusion, we're selling crusty-ass pancakes. We are speaking in a language that only 5 people understand. We're not reaching our audiences. We're often trying to persuade people who will never be with us, but leaving behind the people who are already with us but could be doing more. And so if you take nothing else from my presentation, don't sell crusty-ass pancakes. So we're going to talk about how to prevent that from happening. And I want to give you some of the lessons that we have garnered from research, but also with a partnership with lots and lots of groups in the field, perhaps with some of you in the room, excuse me. And I'm going to try to rely heavily on the visuals so I can preserve my voice through the end. So the first is really engaging audiences strategically. Often, we'll say, we have to be better at reaching the general public. But along with crusty-ass pancakes, I want you to remember that there is no such thing as the general public. None of us can afford to reach everyone. We don't have the resources to do it. And the good news is we don't have to in order to accomplish our goals. We can be much more specific. So here's one way of thinking about audiences. Your deciders, your decision makers who can get you what you want, the governor, perhaps can get you precisely what you want and is your audience, but also the influencers. Who influences the people who you need to make decisions and sustain them in ways that will accomplish your goals? You know who that is in the middle? That graphic, anybody? Swing voters. Yeah, I don't make them up. I just put them on a slide. So. All right. Here is another way to think about audience. On a scale of 1 to 5, the 1s are your base. They're always with you. The 5s will never be with you. The majority of your audience has to be persuaded. But you've got to be thinking about all of them, right? You have to activate your base and persuade the undecided. And to some extent, marginalize the opposition, by which I mean prevent them from persuading the 2s, 3s, and 4s. So you with me so far? Okay. All right, here's the second lesson. Leading with shared values. This is something in our fields we often forget, that we tend to be in policy land and data, and so we will talk about those things. But imagine next week when you go home for Thanksgiving and somebody asks you, well, what are you working on? And you say, well, I'm trying to change the tax credits so that we will further support, right? They're already talking to your cousin, right? So, because they don't connect, and this is true of policymakers as well, that's not why they went into the business that they're in, to only talk policy. So the next level up is issues. So people are familiar with issues, but they are coming to an issue conversation with their own narrative in their heads. And that narrative may or may not help you, but you probably don't know. And so 9 times out of 10, we recommend leading with values, the values that you share with, with your audience. And so if, that same Thanksgiving conversation, What are you working on? Well, we think that everyone should have the opportunity to have a safe and affordable home that gives them access to amenities and opportunities in life. And let me tell you about how we're doing that. Very different conversation. Now, your uncle might still turn away from you. I don't know your uncle, but does that feel different to you? Okay, but so often we begin with policy or even money, which is never the thing that animates people or persuades them. Okay. I'm going to give you two examples. This is Brian Stevenson, who some of you know, excuse me, Harvard graduate who runs the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, an anti-death penalty advocate. This is two different ways that he is talking about race and the death penalty to two different audiences. The first one I'm going to show you is an ABA, American Bar Association conference on the lower left. John, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and play that.
In the United States, we are struggling with capital punishment and its implementation. A short, quick legal history. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court struck down the death penalty after recognizing that it was being applied in an arbitrary manner. The court in 72 noted that 87% of the people executed for the crime of rape were black men convicted of raping white women. 100% of the people executed in the United States between 1930 and 1972 for the crime of rape were executed for offenses involving victims who were white, even though it was believed that women of color were 3 times as likely to be the victims of sexual assault. The court didn't say that the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment and therefore always unconstitutional. They said it was arbitrary, unpredictable, capricious, and therefore unconstitutional. A lot of folks thought that was going to be the end of capital punishment in this country, but as most of you know, states passed new death penalty statutes that were aimed to control these arbitrary features, and by 1976, we had a modern death penalty on the books. It's the modern death penalty that has now produced some 3,500 people awaiting execution, some 1,100 executions in the last 30 years.
Okay, so, Brian's brilliant, but chances are, if you were for the death penalty before hearing this, you're still for it. If you were against it, you're still against it. Excuse me. And with respect to racial equity, many people's default is, well, don't do the crime if you can't do the time, right? Why should I care whether people who've committed murder are disproportionately executed based on their race? So let's take a look at a different clip of Brian, same stats, but telling the story in a different way. Let's look at that second one.
I was giving this lecture in Germany, some lectures in Germany about the death penalty. It was fascinating because one of the scholars stood up after the presentation and said, well, it's deeply troubling to hear what you're talking about. I said, well, we don't have the death penalty in Germany. And of course, we can never have the death penalty in Germany. And the room got very quiet, and this woman said, there's no way with our history we can ever engage in the systematic killing of human beings. It would be unconscionable for us to, in an intentional, deliberate way, set about executing people. And I thought about that. What would it feel like to be living in a world where the nation-state of Germany was executing people, especially if they were disproportionately Jewish? I couldn't bear it. It would be unconscionable. And yet in this country, in the states of the Old South, we execute people where you're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is black, 22 times more likely to get it if the defendant is black and the victim is white. In the very states where there are buried in the ground the bodies of people who were lynched, and yet there is this disconnect. Well, I believe that our identity is at risk. That when we actually don't care about these difficult things, the positive and wonderful things are nonetheless implicated.
Okay, that feels different. So Brian was not saying the death lynchings and now the death penalty in the Old South are just like the Holocaust. That really, it's not quite accurate. It would have actually probably been off-putting to some people. But what he did was lift up the value of equal justice and remind us why that's not just about the person who is executed, it's about all of us and our society and our values. So this is a really important lesson when it comes to talking about racial equity in your own work, is finding those values that you share with your audience around equal opportunity and equity, and lifting those up and finding those metaphors when necessary that can connect to their own experience, but not in a way that is saying, well, this is exactly the same, but rather the values at stake are the same. This was just an example when the chairman of Merck left President Trump's corporate executive council. He issued a statement around diversity as one of our nation's greatest strengths, which went viral. And so I wanted to give you another example from a corporate context of lifting up those values in a way that are shared and that indicate why you're taking a decision that's based on equitable principles. The next is telling a systemic story. Most people's default story about racial justice is highly individual. An individual bigot does something bad to an individual, typically person of color. And that still happens, unfortunately, but much more frequently, we're talking about systemic unequal obstacles that people are facing, excuse me. The disparate impact of zoning decisions, for example. The segregated communities that we are encountering when we have to make decisions about community and economic development. So that systemic story is important. Here's something from here in Boston about some of the historical trajectory of policies from overt segregation and racial covenants to covert discrimination to factors that are not intentionally discriminatory at all, but that tend to perpetuate and intensify inequality. It's one way of telling that systemic story. Here's a second example. Excuse me. A map. This is an opportunity map of the greater Boston area done by the Kirwan Institute. And so you'll see that the green areas, the dark green, are areas of the highest concentration of opportunity, of good quality schools with certified teachers, of high-paying jobs, quality health care. And you'll see, and you probably all of you in this room know, the overlay of where people of color live in the greater Boston area. This scatter map is a little old, actually. And so perhaps doesn't reflect some of the gentrification that's happened. But African Americans and Latinos in particular, but also some other groups, are often physically disconnected from opportunity. And so this kind of imagery helps to tell the story of why we have to work together to address equity. Why it's not just a matter of, well, if you had just finished school, or if your kids would pull their pants up and stop listening to that hip-hop music, right? There are systemic obstacles to equal opportunity, and there are systemic solutions. And we need to tell that systemic story, but in a human way. We're going to skip that. Let's see. There are some specific ways to tell that story. Whoops, we skipped. Sorry. There's some specific ways to tell that story in a human way. And those tend to be about people, including some of your awardees this morning, bless you, who have overcome their own individual obstacles, but they're also working to help entire communities and our city to overcome those obstacles to equal opportunity and equity. Their stories are personally compelling, but they also are inherently systemic. Okay, let's look at the next one. Obstacles before outcomes. So often in our work, we will jump straight to the racially inequitable outcomes, graduation rates or employment rates or what have you. And so you see an example of that here in the left-hand corner. But what we find is that a lot of undecided audiences will assume, remember individual responsibility being the default, will assume, well, so, in this instance, black folks, have less education, or they're not working as hard, or they're not dressing as well on average when they come for an interview, et cetera. And so talking about the unequal obstacles first is important. So this is research that you may have seen that was employment. Blind testing based identical resumes with different names, traditionally black and traditionally white names. You see disparate outcomes. So that the disparate outcomes then flow from those disparate obstacles. And you're telling a story about unequal opportunity, not just about unequal outcome. Because Americans care about equal opportunity. It is a shared value among almost everyone. But there is a lot of discord about equality of outcome and concern about government meddling in that. And so we need to be sure that we're talking about the causes, systemic causes of racial and ethnic inequality as we're talking about the unequal outcomes and the ways of addressing them. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. You can tell I'm stalling. All right. We're almost done. All right, next is emphasizing solutions. There's an expression that we use at the Opportunity Agenda. There's a reason why Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest speech was not called, "I have a complaint." But, think about your work, especially you advocates in the room. I won't call you out, but, knowing that you have a problem is the first step. We are much better, especially as lawyers, much better at saying what's wrong than what the solution is. But Americans are in no mood to hear about a new problem without knowing what the solution is, right? And it needs to be a solution that flows from those values and from a systemic challenge. Okay. This is an important part of emphasizing solutions, which is a contribution model. Be sure to tell your audience how we all benefit if we can solve the problem. We're not just stopping bad things from happening. We're actually helping some good things to happen for our community. And we heard from Joe this morning and from others some of the remarkable things that have come from your work together that benefit the entire state of Massachusetts. And so telling that story is important. We are doing our work to benefit individuals, for sure, but also to create a better state and society, to uplift our shared values, to move forward together. And so telling that part of the story is quite important. A positive role for government. That can be tough right now. There's a lot of cynicism about government, but I can tell you, excuse me, that most people, the vast majority of Americans, want to see government play a positive role as a problem solver, as a maker and enforcer of fair rules, as a force to keep us safe, not only from crime and terrorism, but from unsafe housing conditions and food and all of that. And so we have to tell that story, because remember that the dominant counter narrative is that government cannot and should not do anything. And we need to challenge government when we don't like what it's doing, when it's harmful, but we need to remind our audiences that a strong, effective, inclusive role for government is crucial, and it's also crucial to greater and more equal opportunity, to equity. Okay, I'm gonna make sure I'm looking at the thing. All right, so, excuse me. I'm going to tell you a quick story. So when my older daughter started high school, we went to the Welcome Parents Day. The principal spoke. She was great. Guidance counselor spoke. He was terrific. And then the head of security spoke. And she said, well, if you believe the rumors, you might think that our high school is an open-air drug market. But believe me, it's not an open-air drug market. So once again, not an open-air drug market. So at this point, my wife and I are in a fetal position. Oh my God, we're sending our daughter to an open-air drug market. She then went on to explain why it's not an open-air drug market. I could not tell you a single explanation that she gave us. All I remember, open-air drug market. Okay, so, but think about your own work, your website, things that you do. How often have you tried to bust myths? You may think that immigrants don't pay taxes, but let me tell you they do. You may think that affordable housing will bring, crime and blight into your community, but let me explain to you why that's not going to happen, right? There's a lot of social science research showing that if you tell someone a myth, you bust the myth, you come back to them 2 weeks later, they remember what? You got it. And they may never have heard the myth, right? So now they're getting the myth from you. Right, you're doing your opponent's job. So don't do that. But what should you do instead? Tell your affirmative story. Explain, let me talk to you about the remarkable things that happen when we welcome immigrants into our communities, the ways in which they are creating businesses and jobs, and they are caregivers, and they're paying payroll taxes and Social Security taxes, and many other taxes that if they're undocumented, they may never benefit from. Right? Tell your affirmative story. So I'm actually going to leave you with a concrete example of this from a show some of you may know, and then I'm going to wrap up. So John, let's take a look at that one.
Extremely confident that there's no curse, and everyone's going to have a great time tomorrow, okay?
Wow. First Ice Town, now this. Bad luck really follows you around, huh?
Okay, I'd like to start by addressing some of the false rumors about the festival. First of all, we have plenty of food. There's no food shortage. There are not, as one reporter suggested, dozens of escaped convicts meandering around the carnival. And at no time was any Parks Department worker, quote, feasting on petting zoo animals.
Okay, so I think the point's made, right? Tell your affirmative story. Lead with values. Tell a systemic story. Talk about solutions. I can tell you that the power of more effective communications about equity and also about a lot of your other work is really, really almost magical. It is transformative when people hear you speaking to the values that they hold and that they share with you and an affirmative vision. So thank you so much for the remarkable work you're doing. Thank you for putting up with my voice issues and all of that. I'm glad I got through it with you. And keep up the good work. Thank you.